All right, great. Must be running. Good afternoon. Welcome to History of Economic Thought 1, Econ 355. And we actually have quite a number of people. I'm getting so many messages of people either quarantined or sick with something else or banged up their knee and they can't come. And I can't keep track of everybody, but my proposal is that we're going to just quarantine declare the whole college in quarantine, so we can all be together. We'll just have classes. And then we're going to have them fly in like high-end food and parachute it into us and drink and stuff like that. So this is my plan. I'm going to go and talk to Dr. Arndt about it. I think that should work quite well. I think it's a good idea at least. And what else? Anything else to announce right now? We're live. When I went on the radio the other night, it was funny because getting ready to start, and they said to me, "Okay, before you go on, just remember." And I said, "Don't swear, right?" And they said, "Yes, don't swear." All right, I know. I will try to restrain myself. No bad language. I'll try to do that today as well. Jeremy, no. Okay. Now where were we? Great, that was the highlight of the class. We should probably stop now. All right, where I left off last time, we've gone through Adam Smith, and we talked about some of his critics. Smith lays the foundation for classical economics. Now we have classical economics, they call it political economy and things like this, but it's really understood to be a discipline in itself now. And the people who are first in it aren't really thought of as economists, but they're people who are doing stuff related to that. And so the next one we'll talk about is Jeremy Bentham. Classical economics becomes the dominant economics of the 1800s. I've never been able to fully verify what was done in economics classes here in the 1800s, but chances are pretty good you were studying classical economics. And maybe some of the American system with Henry Carey, but that was partly based on this stuff. So you would have been covering the kinds of things we're going to cover now. The next person we'll talk about is Jeremy Bentham, and he contributes utilitarianism, which becomes important for them. And then we'll also introduce today Thomas Robert Malthus, who contributes his theory of population, developing. Both of these are developments of what people already believed to some extent. But let's start with Jeremy Bentham. And I suspect some of you are familiar with him to some extent. 1748 to 1832, that's when he lived. An Englishman, he's a contributor to the classical school. He's not maybe thought of so much as an economist as he is a philosopher and someone who wrote on legislation and things like that. But his very important implications for economics, and we're going to see those. And most of his publications came between about 1887 and 1798. So he falls between Smith and Ricardo. Ricardo comes a little bit later. And he is a developer of the idea, this is what he's most famous for, at least for he's most famous for, developer of utilitarianism. Who's familiar with utilitarianism? Imagine, you've probably all heard of it to some extent. Any reaction to it? So Connor, I think you raised your hand. Or good, bad, indifferent, what?
Just no.
No, just no. Didn't mean to do that, but.
Like utterly amoral, like not necessarily moral or immoral, just like not even dealing with morality, like whatever is best for the majority is great. And it doesn't matter necessarily how that impacts those people, just that the majority is beneficial. Assuming that's the correct understanding.
Bentham actually argues that is moral. That is what morality is, in a sense.
I mean, there are some limits onto it, to kind of the implied majoritarian view of it, just that's whatever goes. But there is kind of a practicality element to going with it.
So I think that if you talk to I know that if you talk to some of our politics professors, utilitarianism is bad. And they're natural rights theorists. They think that utilitarianism is a a serious mistake, I'm going to at least partially defend it, and on a kind of basis as we'll look at the good points and the bad points or whatever, for better or worse. But in 1789 is the key work. 1789, his Principles of Morals and Legislation. He was a prolific author, wrote a lot, but this is the key one for us. Principles of Morals and Legislation. And this is a dealing with the idea of what can we say about ethics, and then how can we apply that to governing and to law? How do we define what is good and what is desirable? How do we then develop rules, policies, and laws? Okay, what can we do with that? And in tackling this problem, he says, first of all, he develops the idea of utility. And for Bentham, utility is a bit different than it has been for other people, because he says that this would be the individuals, so singular, and utilities and individuals, evaluations of pleasure and pain. Great. Oh, you can trace back to, to the ancient. The notion goes back to the hedonic view of the ancient Greeks. Okay. Great. Bentham. That's the same thing in essence as the individual's evaluation of what is good and what is bad for them. Good and bad. It's subjective. Notice that this stuff applies to the individual. It is subjective. Now, this is Bentham's definition or meaning of what he's getting at with utility. Adam Smith writes about utility, and some of the other people previous to Bentham. But when they talk about utility, they're talking about physical utility. They have a different meaning. Iron has utility because you can make a frying pan out of it. Okay, that's the physical usefulness, or the things you can devote it to. A frying pan has utility in that you can fry bacon and eggs or whatever in it. Okay, that's the physical uses of the thing. Bentham's talking about something different. He's saying individual evaluations of pleasure and pain. Is it good for me or bad for me? Is it useful for me or bad or not useful for me? That kind of thing. And his second observation, or his second idea, is that what do individuals do? Well, individuals maximize. I'll put it this way. They maximize. Let me not even say that yet. Individuals rationally calculate so as to maximize utility. That is to say, they try to get the maximum net pleasure. Okay. We'll have to say something about what that might mean. And then he says, this idea, this principle, could be used to design laws and policies. I'll just say in governing, but we're designing policies, we're designing laws, we're writing laws, constitutions, whatever. Take that into account. That's the principle we'll use. We'll try to end up maximizing things. Various reforms that we're proposing should take that into account. That's what they should be based on. And here's how he's going to argue this. He first says, his first part of his argument is laid out at the positive level, the level of positive economics or positive theory. And he says, this is the theory at the individual level. So by positive, it is not what should be done. This is just what people do, he says. This is how people behave. And so this is at the positive level, and it applies to the individual. And he says, individuals do the following. He says, every individual choice, every individual action involves a pleasure-pain trade-off. There'll be some good consequences and some bad consequences. People evaluate those and judge, they will act accordingly. And so it works, benefit versus cost shouldn't be too shocking to us. And he says, first of all, their feelings of pleasure and pain. Feelings of pleasure and pain guide the understanding. Guide, I will say, we want to make sure it's the individual. Okay. It guides their emotions. It guides their will. Great. Is that a good thing for me or a bad thing for me? I don't know. How do I feel about it? But that gives me the understanding, and the understanding will, what do we say? Evaluates and calculates the trade-offs. Okay, there might be some good consequences, some bad consequences, or some pleasurable and painful ones, and then the person chooses accordingly. Should I do this thing or not? Well, I don't know. What are the net benefits? Or is it net? Are they positive or negative? And then action follows, and the consequences. The results. Okay, great. That's a model of human behavior, and that's his model. That's how he thinks people behave. That's positive theory. That's what people do. And he calls it the felicity calculus. Great. That's a Y. The felicity calculus. And it's a utility, then, is the thing that comes out of that. It's a measure of something of well-being or happiness or how people's welfare. Okay. All right, good. Makes sense? Everyone agrees? Do you agree that this is how people behave? Who thinks this is the model of how people behave? Anyone? Benjamin, anyone else? Okay. Put your hand up if you do. Come on, don't be cowards. I've got mine up. I actually think it is, kind of. Well, properly understood. Any objections to it? Yes, why?
I feel like it's a decent baseline in general, but there's, like with anything, there's some exceptions to it, but I feel like in this case there's a lot more exceptions that could be found, like you have religion or moral codes or things like that.
Okay, so I'm going to write these down because so what are some objections to this? What if people follow, what if instead people are guided by religion or moral codes, moral principles? Well, we'll call it codes, principles, whatever. Okay, other points other points?
No,
You said, okay.
So for the sake of argument, I think you can make the case, okay, when people are making decisions, they aren't quote unquote rationally calculating X, Y, and Z, or whatever decision will have X amount of marginal benefit in relation to X amount of marginal cost. However, I think it can be qualified under all those things, including religion, morality, and so on and so forth, that those things are inherent in this kind of analysis.
Okay. But you did say that they're not rationally calculating.
Right,
that might be
for the sake of argument, but
okay.
I think Bentham's...
We don't need, right now I just want to know the criticism. Then we're going to sort this stuff out carefully, I think, before we're done. Yeah, first of all, yes, I agree with your sake of argument, and then you say we can sandwich, we can probably, might be able to put these things back in, I guess, but.
Sometimes we don't evaluate trade-offs based on our understanding of pleasure and pain, but on other things.
Such as?
End results, like virtue of character.
Like, what did you say?
End results, like virtue of character. If you're doing something courageous, it's probably painful and it's an act, but you do it for the end result.
Okay. Virtue and character, I guess. I'm trying to think of just how to write it down. That's all. Okay, maybe we're pursuing a different goal than what seems to be there. Other thoughts or objections? Yes.
I don't know if this is a criticism, but like, what exactly does he mean by pleasure and pain? Like, if something is detrimental to yourself but might benefit your family members, for instance, so you want to do it, does that still count as pleasurable?
Yeah, good question. How do we define these things? Well, this is ambiguous. Bentham really is willing to incorporate, it gives me pleasure that my family is better off even though I have to work or do something that's painful or whatever. That could still fit into it. That we might be able to get around that objection, okay? That is, how do we define it? Yeah, Joshua.
I mean, I would probably argue that, like, dealing with religion and moral codes, I mean, that actually still qualifies under the philosophy calculus, specifically if, like, say, I lay down my life for some person, like, even though, or whatever, I give up something. I gain spiritual pleasure, even though I get free of physical. Like, I guess it depends. If you understand pleasure as being merely physical, like, oh yeah, whatever, drinking alcohol is fun or whatever, then yeah, then religion and morality
Okay.
would not qualify. But I guess if you say that, well, when I give my money to the poor, sure, it means that I am worse off. However, I get a spiritual pleasure, and that makes me happy to give poor. It makes me happy to lay down my life. It gives me pleasure to be moral. I mean, I guess you could still argue that that philosophy calculus still works with religious morals.
So Bentham's argument, first of all, I have to say that Bentham, if we stop a second, right there, that is morality for Bentham, okay? Our evaluations of good and bad according to our pleasure, it's subjective. That really is, he calls this principles of morals and legislation. There it is. That determines good versus bad, okay? So to say that there's maybe that there's some sort of overarching, this is moral and that's not moral, and it gives me pleasure to do the moral thing and pain to do the immoral thing, or vice versa, would not really be true to Bentham is saying, but it is not exactly clear that having a religion or a moral code affects this. If we just say, I believe that that's, committing a sin is, it gives me pain and, gives me pleasure to do good or do virtue, couldn't be incorporated in this. It's kind of empty of content. It's whatever gives the person evaluates is giving them pleasure or pain. So that one we can probably adapt to fit this. And we can probably adapt that one too, because as we'll see, we definitely can do that. It'll be even more clear in a minute, because you're making pleasure-pain trade-offs. And you might say, well, it's hard to do this and it hurts and all this, but in the long run, I'll be very pleased with the outcome and it'll even be better than the pain. Benefit-cost trade-off. Everything has benefits and costs involved. We want to maximize those. Okay, well, what else? That one right there, we aren't rationally calculating. Let's put it this way. We definitely don't have a perfect understanding, but we, according to the understanding we do have, at least I think this is what people do. I'm going to have you guys, for those of you who are already had been in HET II, you had to read the first chapter of Karl Menger's Principles of Economics, the first book ever written by an Austrian in Austrian economics. Talks about people doing this, and he says, but they are often ignorant about the laws of cause and effect, and they choose things that we look at and think, well, that was you didn't know what you were doing, but you did the best you could given your flawed knowledge. You were still rational, in other words. You chose the best you could given your understanding. Ludwig von Mises says the same thing. So perfect understanding isn't a requirement for that, for things to be rational. And at any rate, so at least there might be ways of getting around those objections. But note those objections. What we're talking, that's real simple stuff I've told you right there. It's built into most of the economics you study. It's really simple, but it's all kinds of controversy here on this. We'll say more about it in a second. Any other questions or thoughts? Well, Bentham continues and he says, wow, utility is a measure of happiness and a measure of well-being But how do I observe it? Like, I can't look inside your heads and see your utility. Given some of the expressions I see, the utility is 0 at best. You know, at any rate, go ahead, fall asleep. No, don't. Bentham says, well, there might be a way of getting around that, at least an approximation. We could use money or wealth as proxies, because people tend to be, the more money they have, the better off they feel or happier. So that might be a way of kind of getting at it. And of course, economists try to convert things into dollars or into monetary terms if we can, just as a way of making them comparable. Okay, so at any rate, great. Well, there's the first thing that he does. That is a positive theory. He says, that's just the way people behave. That's the way they act. And I think that may be properly understood with the right footnotes and qualifications. I agree. You might or might not, but that's at least what kind of his point is. His next idea then is an idea of social utility. And without belaboring the point, this is definitely normative. And it's hardly obvious that well, I'll just tell you, it's hardly obvious that this is going to be true. But he says that he asked the following question. He says, can utility be compared across individuals? For example, if I know your utility and I know your utility, can I make comparisons scientifically or objectively about, what's better, what's worse, or compare them in some way? So his question is, can we have, let's put it this way, are scientific, or in other words, objective comparisons of utility of different utilities, I guess, different individuals possible? That is to say, are scientific or objective interpersonal comparisons of utility possible? Interpersonal comparison of utility. It's long-winded here. And Bentham says, Jeremy Bentham says, his answer is yes. He acknowledges that that's actually not certain. It might be controversial, it's questionable, but he says, yeah, we can do it. He says he wants to do it because that's going to be so useful for his project. And he says, not only that, and it's additive. That is to say, not only can I compare it objectively, but I could add your utility to your utility and get the total utility of the two of you. In fact, if this room is our society, I could take the utility of each one of you, add it up, and get the total social utility and tell how well off our room is. Great, and then I could know that and do something. So his idea is that you could do the following. Calculate, at least in principle, calculate utility for each member of society. Okay, why are we doing this? Because we're going to evaluate a proposed policy. We're thinking of passing a new law or a new reform. Should we do it or not? Or maybe some event occurs and we want to say, did that make people better off or worse off? Was it good or bad for society? But we're going to say, to evaluate a policy, calculate the utility for each member of society that comes from that policy, add up everyone's utility, and that gives us social utility. That's the result. Great. Now, pretty clearly, that's normative. And he then says, of course, if it's good, big, positive number, we should do that thing. So you remember I talked about Lauderdale and Ray last lecture. and close by Bentham saying this stuff that they're talking about is nonsense. They're talking about a difference between the national interest and the interest of the people in the country. That makes no sense at all. The interest of this room is our society. The interest of this room versus the interest of all the people in it, those have got to be the same thing. If I add up the well-being of you, every one of you, and me, I get the well-being of our society. There isn't anything else. That's why he makes that argument against Lauderdale and Ray, which I think makes sense to me, although I don't know about adding things up. Great. Well, how do you go about this? And here's the way he conceives of it. He says, suppose we can do the following. Let's clear this. Suppose our society consists of n individuals. N is any big number. I guess it's something like 330 million people in the United States, something like that. So however that is, we are going to consider, I don't know, an event or a policy. We'll just call it event E. That's the name of our event or our policy that we're contemplating. When we're thinking about passing law, we'll just call it E or whatever it is. And so the first thing we do is we're going to index individuals by I. So we'll have person I equals person 1, person 2, person ... all the way to person N. Okay, 330 million if it's the United States. And so for the ith individual, he proposes that first of all, calculate, how about number 1, the values of the immediate pleasures from E. And again, maybe that will not be really formally defined as just like physical pleasure, but whatever advantages, their utility, their positive ideas. And so for that person, for person I, that would be UI equals 0. That would give us a utility number. We know that I said equals, we know it's positive because those are the pleasures, right? And then we will also calculate the values of the immediate pains for person I. And so those would be the negative numbers, a negative number. Then we'll do the values of the secondary pleasures. And so this will be more positive, another positive number. And then we'll calculate the values of secondary pains for that person. And that will give us another negative number. Add all those up, and we'll get the utility that person I gets from that thing. Okay? UI of E, and that will be, I don't know what it'll be. Will it be positive, negative, or 0? I don't know. Do the pains outweigh do the pleasures outweigh the pains or not? But so, for example, it might be that the immediate effect is that, oh, it hurts. I'm doing something virtuous and it's really painful, and so I get a negative. I got no pleasure immediately. It was a 0. That was a -2. Secondary pleasure, though, was 100 because now I'm a virtuous person or something. So no secondary pains. Oh, it was in 98. Okay, so that answers your objection or your comment. Okay, great. Well, I do that for everybody in the society. Okay, that's the first step. And the second one is to find social utility. So social utility of E, let's call it U, social utility of E. I don't know, my notation is goofy. But social utility, no, that's not what I want to do. We'll add them all up and put social right there, of event E would be equal to the utility for person 1 plus the utility for person 2 plus ... add them all up together, all the way up to n, and that will be greater than, equal to, or less than 0. And then Bentham says, of course, you need a decision rule. Now that we know what the social utility effect of that policy is, the answer, or the decision rule, is if it is positive, then that's a good policy. Do it. Implement that. Okay? Makes sense. Okay? This is sometimes described as being the greatest good for the greatest number. Okay? That's what you've just done. Okay? Lots of people and more benefit than there was cost. Okay? Greatest good for the greatest number is not literally true. But you can kind of see that. And Bentham also says, now, again, we can't really do that. It's 330 million. You can't actually do that in practice. It would be not feasible. But we should at least try to do something, at least try to take that into account. Get as close to that as possible. Okay? That is to say, we will consider, evaluate, weigh all the consequences of our actions or policies as best we can. Okay? And again, that's obviously a normative principle. He says we should do that. Okay. Any comments or questions or objections or thoughts or anyone? Reactions?
Doesn't that lead out to people who really don't want the thing to happen? I mean, it includes their
Right.
preference, but
It includes their preferences, it includes their utilities, but they got the short end of the stick.
we're not concerned about that.
Not by this criterion.
How short is that end of the stick? Is it, dead? I mean, under that logic, it might be.
Okay. Yes, Jack.
Are we assuming that utility is being measured in wealth, like you said earlier, as a proxy?
That would be a way of doing it. But in principle, if only we could see people, Bentham believes in utils. If only we could count utils, if we could get like if only I had a device that would x-ray your brains and I found out how empty they really were. No, that's not what I meant to say. Sorry, that's not what I meant to say. What I meant to say was I have a device and I can look inside and I can see your utils. Neuroeconomics or something like this. I can put you on a brain scanner or something and find out your utils. Everybody wear one around, will maximize utility. Oh, this sounds dark. But at any rate, so what about the people who get the short end of the stick? In fact, would it even be a minority? So based on what we have right here, which is what Bentham suggests, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin got so much utility from being dictator that everybody else, like, so what? Okay, you're Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler's benefit was so great that it outweighed everybody else's cost. I can't rule it out from that. Oh, here's another one that might even be less weird. What if the German people say, yes, the Fuhrer has called upon us to exterminate the Jews. We'll all be happier if we do. Okay, there's only a few of them. There's only 6 million of them or whatever. So do it, because the benefits to the many outweigh the losses to the few. Maybe that's what that gets at. Now, we'll have to qualify things a bit because, I don't know, that doesn't sound... Anyway, that's Murray Rothbard's criticism, for example. A number of people, Rothbard's criticism, that's I think, what also you'd hear from the politics department here. But Rothbard says, yeah, okay, great. Suppose they decide the majority decides, oh, wouldn't it be fun if we just execute all the red-haired people? There's hardly any of them. We'll just get rid of them. They will be goofed, but anybody have... Not really. Joseph Hissam was kind of getting unsettled when he was in here. Anyway, never mind. Actually, we're not going to do it. It's just a Rothbard's example. Great. So, actually, I think I was going to send you guys 2 papers. I think I'll send you. I might send you a third one if I can dig it up. There's actually a really interesting Jack Butler, when he was a student in here, when we were talking about this, he immediately sent me a pretty well-known science fiction short story that addresses this. It's actually a pretty interesting thing about utilitarianism. I may send that to you too. Anyway, so what are the implications of all? That's Bentham's system. Okay. What are some of the implications, or what are the implications for classical economics? Well, first of all, economists, generally speaking, classical economists, accept that that is the model of human behavior, of how people act. I mean, that this is how people actually act to do that. They accept that people maximize utility, so to speak. They seek pleasure, they avoid pain, however they define it. And what's really important about that is that it means that people systematically respond to changes in incentives. Okay? If you raise the cost of something, you get a different effect than if you lower the cost. It affects behavior in predictable ways. That's actually quite important. I believe it. You probably all believe it because you're all econ students. You'd be surprised how many Marxists find that controversial, or how many other schools of thought or socialists say, no, that's not how people behave at all. Or they behave just according to learned rules, and they don't do any of this maximizing stuff. This is nonsense that economists have thought of. Okay, well, actually I think Bentham is right that this is what people do if we properly understand, put in the, understand that people define pleasure and pain rather broadly as to be the things they prefer and they don't prefer. Okay? It's not just happy, because you might do things that that you prefer to do, but they make you feel emotionally worse. If you ever have to, I almost can't say this, it's so painful, but take your dog to the vet to have it put down, but you might think it's the better thing to do. I mean, it might be much more fun to take your, never mind. I'll just say something I shouldn't say. Never mind. Dogs are more important than people. I can't help it. So, in some sense. Anyway, so a corollary that Bentham draws from this and that classical economists do is that usually, in general, individuals are better judges than anybody else of what's good for them or bad for them. It's the individual who knows whether it's pleasure or pain and what those things are and how they affect them and how they weight them. And that means that there's a presumption in classical economics that laissez-faire and freedom are better than not. Okay, there's a bias or a presumption in favor of freedom that comes out of this, because usually individuals would be the better judges of what's good and bad for them. And that's what we're seeking. Okay? Utilitarianism, another point, is that the classical economists see that utilitarianism is the basis for determining and defending policy. And the free market system is defended on the basis that it will do more good for more people than alternative systems will. They'll have better outcomes. Free trade is defended on the same grounds. Yeah, some people will be hurt, but those are the monopolists. We could protect them, but the vast majority of people will be better off with free trade, so their gains are better than the losses of the few monopolists. Okay? That's how the classicals argue. And Bentham himself says the first principle of government that comes from this is be quiet. That is, don't do a lot. Mostly just turn it over for kind of a laissez-faire kind of a thing. But Bentham also says there is no implicit harmony. Adam Smith has told us that in a natural state of affairs, with protected property rights maybe, but natural state of affairs, or the physiocrats will say that people will tend to have harmony of interests until the government gets in and messes it up. And Bentham says, no, that's nonsense. And he also says natural rights. He describes natural rights as nonsense on stilts. And he says, it's a ridiculous idea, natural rights. He says, this is the sole basis of legislation and morality and legislation. Wow. So, I don't know, any comments? Anyone? Oh. Okay, well,
Natural rights are nonsense on stilts.
okay, other Anyone else?
Could you explain what he means by natural rights being nonsense?
He just thinks it's nonsense, and it's so nonsensical that it's like, it's on stilts. It's like really high nonsense, or like really like, it's not just nonsense, it's really nonsense. Well, we would say nonsense on steroids. Yes?
Does he have any objective moral view?
No.
Okay, so.
Well, not really. I like easy questions, really easily answered questions. I guess his moral view is that maximize pleasure, minimize pain, according to how people see it.
If like let's say you take pleasure from killing people. Like,
Yeah?
No.
There's the problem. If it depends how literally we take this.
Would he say that other people's displeasure from that would be so much greater in the society that that would make it a social negative thing?
Would you say what? That.
So would you say other people's displeasure at someone murdering someone for pleasure?
All right, this is my example. There's Hitler. Okay, and Hitler doesn't mind that he's inflicted pain on everybody else in the world, but he gets to be the Fuhrer. And so I guess if he gets, 1 billion, well, everybody else gets negative. Okay, suppose we get a new dictator. I don't know who that is. President Xi becomes dictator of the world. All right, and we've gotten to the point where there are 10 billion people, and everybody gets one negative udel from it. Okay, so there's 10 billion negative udels, but President Xi gets 100 billion udels. It looks like why there's a 90 billion gain. He gets to be dictator, and everybody else is out of luck. I mean, I can't rule that out. It's just like, wow, he's achieved nirvana or something. It doesn't seem like the best. I don't know how I would. The point. Look, is that likely or a reasonable thing? I don't know. But I've laid out the principle here, and now I'm trying to apply it. But again, we can't even see anybody's utils. Okay. I mean, if it's done on I don't know. This is a criticism, at least, that it can be leveled against this. Or suppose that there's only one person who gets hurt, okay? But they get hurt in a way that we think is so brutal and unfair or whatever, but everybody else is happy and gains. Is it worth it? There are all kinds of, do you guys know John Rawls? The writer John Rawls, philosopher John Rawls, argued that the way to take these kinds of ideas and apply them in a better, fairer way would be to maximize the utility of the worst off person in your society. Instead of maximizing the total utility, make sure that the worst off person is as well off as possible. That is, you draw a floor on badness or something. So there are the ways of taking these ideas and then developing other sorts of moral rules out of them. Okay. Great. I don't know. Did that help? Okay. Well, did it hinder? Did it inflict more pleasure than pain? Let's see. Well, okay. Most economists would. So first of all, do people behave this way? Do they maximize net pleasure? Most economists today, I think, would say yes, if we define pleasure properly to be simply that which is preferred. Okay? This doesn't mean that it makes you happy necessarily. It's just that you prefer that to something else. Do they do this? I guess do people do this rationally? That's sometimes controversial. And so long as we don't take rational to mean perfect knowledge and perfect calculating ability, but simply systematically choosing what you prefer to not prefer, the way that Ludwig von Mises does, then I think, yeah, that is what people actually do. And rational does make sense. If you mean they do it perfectly, I'm skeptical that anybody does anything perfectly, besides me, of course. But I'm skeptical of that. Is everybody, This is really how economists tend to understand action. People which pick what's the cost, next best alternative. Because they ranked one thing higher than another, chose this, the cost is the next best alternative. If you think that's not what people do, then what the heck is cost? That's why I think some of the behavioral economists who say people aren't rational don't realize perhaps how radical their position is, because they also thrown the notion of cost out the window. There are also behavioral economists who say that really we just have to remember that rational doesn't mean they're perfectly capable of calculating or understanding everything. They might make mistakes, but at least they're trying to do that. So it depends. What else can we say about it? Well, here's a question that comes up for economists. Are the utilities of different people really calculable? Not calculable, comparable or additive? And in fact, this is a criticism that modern economics tells us there's no such thing as objective social utility. That the answer to this right here is not yes. Where'd my eraser go? It's no, okay, for modern economics. And Kenneth Arrow, his impossibility theorem, which he called the possibility theorem, actually does a formal mathematical proof to say that not necessarily is it even possible to come up with an unambiguous social utility. It's not possible. There is no such thing as an unambiguous, objective social utility. I can add your utils to yours. No, that's actually not right. Okay, we could try, imagine I can make these comparisons myself, but there's nothing it's subjective. I do it according to my own preferences. If I take $1 away from you and give it to her, you can say, oh wow, my gain outweighed his loss. And he says, my loss outweighed her gain. Okay? And there's no way of resolving that. It's just how each one evaluates it. Or you might say, wow, his loss was worse than my gain. I would rather give it's subjective. It's how people evaluate these things. And we do this, of course. Another question, is everybody weighted the same? They're utils. If this is a saint and this is a murderer, do we put more weight on the good person than the bad person? Well, it added a definition of good to that. How about the rich versus the poor? I've got $1,000, I'm going to give it away. I guess if I give it to Bill Gates, it's just as good as if I give it to some woman whose husband just died and she's got 4 kids to take care of and she's out of work. Both are just as good. Bill Gates wouldn't even know if $1,000 drops out of his pocket and falls on the ground. It's not even worth it for him to pick up. His opportunity cost is too great. He won't miss it anyway. He doesn't even know. So most economists would say, yeah, these are real problems. You can't make interpersonal comparisons of utility. That's why we have things like Pareto optimality, Pareto improvement, because then you don't have to. So what's Pareto improvement? That's the idea that you're contemplating a change. If that change makes one person better off, but nobody worse off, then you can say, okay, that is better. That's unambiguously a social improvement because nobody's worse off, nobody complains, but one person's better off. It's better. But if it makes one person better off, but one person worse off, we can't evaluate it objectively. And Pareto optimum, of course, is where you can't make a change to make one person better off without making someone worse off. So you just can't do it. Or economists, because that's a unanimity criterion. It's so hard. Many situations can't be evaluated. So we come up with things like Kaldor-Hicks. I'm not going to require you to do anything with that right now, but the Kaldor-Hicks criterion where we say, well, in principle, could the people who gain pay off the ones who lose enough to make them willing to accept it and they still gain? Well, if so, it's a good move or something like that. So that's why economists come up with those things, because you can't make interpersonal comparisons of utility. All right, questions while we race? If any, just ask, because I can't see you. Apparently everything is crystal clear. Amartya Sen. I want to talk about how Sen, I kind of like doing this. We're looking at some very old ideas and how do they fit into current economics. This is relevant. Sen lived from 1933 to, well, last I checked, he was still alive. He got his Nobel Prize in 1998. He's been at Harvard and other schools. Very famous guy, really interesting economist. And he got his Nobel Prize for his work in development economics, but especially in welfare economics, analyzing questions like this. And so he analyzes utilitarianism, and he says, what can we say about it that's good and what that might be questionable? And so on the good side, he says, here are the good points of utilitarianism. And he says, number one, it focuses attention on consequences. It puts our attention on what are the consequences of policies or events. If we propose a policy, what will the effect be? Consequences, only the consequences that we focus on in this. So that's actually good, though, because that you focus on consequences. You pass a law. Oh, we want to make people better off, but what if it makes them worse off? It doesn't matter what our intention is. What are the actual results? We pass, oh, we want workers to make more money. So let's pass a minimum wage law. Oh, this didn't have good consequences. It put a whole bunch of people out of work. We should have taken the consequences into account. What else? It focuses on the well-being of individuals. Well, that's good. We want people to be well off. You know, these extreme examples where I'm comparing Hitler to, you know, the people he's destroying or whatever, those are pretty weird examples. But for the most part, making people better off sounds like a good idea. Policies that will do that. It's pretty much all that this focuses on. What are some of the, we'll call them not bad, but we'll call it limitations of this? Here's the good. And he lays out some pretty interesting ones. First of all, there's the problem of weighting. Weighting. How much weight do you put on each person's utility? So great, there's the good person, and there's the saint, and there's the demon or the bad person. Do we give them the same weight, the same valuation, the murderer and the person who goes out and rescues people? Well, in fact, interpersonal comparisons aren't scientific. They require value judgment. If we say, oh, let's weight them the same, we've made a value judgment. If we say we weight them differently, we've made a value judgment. We can't get around that. They're not objective. That is to say, they're not scientific. We can make them. You might prefer to see you might have a friend and an enemy, and you'd rather see a benefit bestowed on your friend than your enemy. You make decisions like that. Parents do this all the time. They have to keep order within the family, choosing which child will get to play with the toy or whatever. Distributional issues would also be important. And again, that's related to weighting. But for the way that this is set up, it's the sum total that matters, and that's all. Well, what if it's a huge gain for this person and small losses for everybody else? But is that fair, or is that good? Or a few people suffered horribly and a whole bunch of people kind of get gains, but the gains outweigh the losses? Is that fair? We start thinking about, and he says, fairness falls into this. We have other concepts in fact, and speaking of other concepts, how about this thing has a neglect of rights and freedoms? Doesn't that matter? Well, rights don't fit into this. Right? You can kind of there are ways of wedging these things into, putting these things into utilitarianism, but at least the basic form of it doesn't have any room for that stuff. That might actually be important, though. Okay. And here's one that I really like because it's interesting to think about. How about adaptation and mental conditioning? What do you mean by this? You guys ever see a video footage of Kim Jong-un's funeral? Now, some of it was probably fake because if you're in North Korea, you have to show that you are perfectly in allegiance to the state, because otherwise you're dead, literally. So people go to the funeral, but the way they're carrying on, it's not all fake, I don't think. People in this society, in North Korea, so Kim Il-sung was the founder, the first communist dictator. His son, Kim Jong-il, was the next one, and now Kim Jong-un, his grandson, run the societies. People are taught from childhood that the Kim family is like gods, and that their well-being depends on the well-being of the Kims. And when they say things like, oh my God, he left us, how can they leave us? How could he have left us in our time of need? It's not all fake. People are brainwashed into this. And you read about some of the North Korean defectors who finally get fed up with the system. But some of the things that they find out about their system after, it's a little bit different, but one of the North Korean defectors, when he got to the South Korea and he's talking to people, he suddenly found out that the North had started the Korean War and the South hadn't. He passed out. He was in such shock. His world was just turned upside down. People do see the Kims as being like gods. Many of them do. Well, are those people really know what's good for them? Their calculations might be totally twisted up by brainwashing. Or maybe yours were. You ever think about that? Anyway, that's all right. I'm working to, I'll straighten you out. Well, it's manipulable. So how do we count those things? This is what Sen raises as a problem. Okay, great. Well, good. Well, let me just say a little bit more about that. Any questions as I erase more? Let's make two more distinctions. Modern distinctions, not made by Bentham, but the distinction between act utilitarianism, because I don't want to completely dismiss it, I don't think I have yet, and rule utilitarianism. And what are these? Well, act utilitarianism is really what Bentham is talking about. And so this seeks to evaluate everything on the basis of outcomes or consequences or results. Okay. That's the criteria that we ultimately use, his version. We'll at least try to measure the full consequences and then say whether we think something's good or bad. But rule utilitarianism recognizes that's impossible. We can't possibly do that. But we should be paying attention to consequences. Well, interpersonal, this recognizes that interpersonal comparisons, scientific, objective ones, of utility are impossible. It's an impossible task conceptually and also practically. But instead, what we do is we will ask what rules, what institutions, laws, whatever, but rules and institutions would likely generate the best outcomes for people. For most people. I'll put it that way. It asks this, and then it tries to pick those rules accordingly. Ludwig von Mises says that he's a utilitarian, and that's the basis that he says that's why the free market is a better choice than other systems. Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, so John Stuart Mill. Mill is a utilitarian, but he seems, in my reading of Mill at least, John Stuart Mill, very much a utilitarian, seems to think that if we act as if people had natural rights, that would be the best system. Natural rights may be nonsense, but it's a great idea if we could follow that. So utilitarianism of this sort, I mean, if we're going to condemn utilitarianism as just wrong, how do we account for the fact that Mises, Hayek, Friedman, so I think some of the best economists who advocate free markets find this to be a useful notion. So they're not natural rights theater advocates. So at any rate, good. So it's at least compatible with the idea of natural rights in that case. Questions? Observations? Thoughts? Everybody's a utilitarian now? Or something? All right, good. Well, there's Bentham. That's enough about Bentham. If there's nothing, we'll move on quickly. I'd like to at least introduce Malthus. And Thomas Robert Malthus, and he went by, if you're going to call him just by one name, Robert Malthus. He didn't use Thomas for himself. So he lived 1766 to 1834. And as everybody knows, he predicted the end of the world, we're all going to starve to death, and the world will collapse, and overpopulation will... Actually, he didn't say that. That's not what he said. He said something a little different. People today know what the neo-Malthusians, many of the, like Paul Ehrlich, who we'll talk about later, but some of the modern and more radical environmentalists say that, you know, the world's going to come to an end because of overpopulation. And we'll destroy ourselves, and they talk about die-off. You know, 1 billion or more people will die because of the disaster and destroy the environment, maybe the whole population. Not what he argued. He does argue that potentially we could get such a big population that most people live a very poor life. We have too many people and not enough additional productivity. Okay, but we'll get to that. But the things that modern neo-Malthusians say are not what he said, and I don't think he would get along very well with them. Now, his father, the story behind him, he was an Anglican minister. His father, Daniel Malthus, was a friend of David Hume, and so Malthus knew him growing up. His father was a friend of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, when he fled France thinking people were after him, he stayed at the family cottage. So young Malthus knew Rousseau. And Malthus goes to Cambridge University to study theology and philosophy. He becomes an Anglican minister. And he also becomes the first economist of note after Adam Smith. How does he become an economist? Well, he came home from Cambridge on fall break or something. And he has dinner with his father. And his father had been reading a book. His father had been reading a book by William Godwin. And William Godwin's book, 1793, was The Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, the full title continues, and its influence on morals and happiness. And Godwin is inspired by the French Revolution, and he has the idea that great reforms could come and we can really make the world better. He's got optimism about this. Major social reform, and Godwin argues that government is currently, here's Godwin's argument. Government is currently a necessary evil. Okay. But we could get rid of it if we were to abolishing law and private property would allow us to achieve a kind of human perfection. Property. Should be private property. That will allow the achievement of human perfection. I think this is the first place where we really come across this notion of we are going to change human nature in some sense, to achieve utopia. Because that's what he says. He says, people will, if we can get rid of private property, it'll be just like in Plato's Republic. We'll have abolished all the conflict among people. Why, we'll have perfect harmony, complete harmony of interests. We'll have an end to crime and misery. People won't be striving to get the property. They won't be unequal. Things will be great. In fact, we will have perfect health. And he speculates that things might get so good, people will have immortality. We might achieve immortality if we do this. Wow, he's promoting utopian anarchism. We can have abolished government, abolished private property, return to nature, utopia ensues. Malthus comes home from college and his father is reading this book and saying, wow, this is great stuff. When you guys get home and your parents are saying, this is great stuff, why don't you go out and join Antifa? You might go, wait a minute, my economics professor is, what would Pongrasic say? Or something. So Malthus is shocked and he argues and he starts converting his father. And his father says, you have really good arguments. Why didn't you write them down? In fact, you should write them down and publish them. And Malthus in 1798 publishes his book. In 1798, he publishes his essay on the principle of population. The first edition, later editions get expanded and big, but the first one is short and sweet. And it is actually pretty good reading. You should read it. Essay on the principle of population as it affects the future improvement of society, with remarks on speculations of Mr. Godwin, Monsieur Condorcet, and other writers. And the first edition is short and to the point, and that's humans are going to breed, if you do this, humans are going to breed faster than the food supply, and that's disaster. You're going to have a big, poor population if you do this kind of foolishness. That's his argument. The neo-Malthusians, therefore, think, well, Malthus was our guy, population too big. And Malthus makes a very famous assertion in here. He says that population growth is geometric. Population growth goes something like 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. Those are the numbers that he writes that down. And then he says food supply grows. The food growth is 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, look how much faster that grows than that one. Disaster. Yeah, he just writes those numbers down. Like, okay, great, true. So what? Like, why do you write those numbers down? Can you explain why you think that? And it's a frightening assertion, but it's just an assertion. Thomas Sowell and a number of other people point this out, and they say, that looks like that seems false, because everything that we eat almost everything, unless you're talking about some whales, everything we eat grows, if you're Japanese or Eskimos or something, everything we eat grows faster than we do. Most food crops, you plant them in the spring and they're up in the fall. That's how fast you can get a new food supply can grow. And most animals that we eat, 1 to 2 years to maturity and reproduction. Humans are a lot longer than that. So humans should grow slower than the food supply if we want. Okay, so why don't we just dismiss this whole thing as nonsense? And the reason we don't is because Malthus then develops an even better argument. He doesn't do it quite right off the bat. It's not clear, but I'll answer in a second. His argument involves diminishing marginal productivity. That is to say, there may be some sort of limits to how much growth we can get, and we will hit that limit because of diminishing marginal product stories. Brianna.
Was he accounting for, more people means more people are working to make food, or is he just talking about food growing naturally?
He just wrote this down. He doesn't say anything like that. He just said, there's population, there's food. I don't know. He just said, that's it. That's a quote from the book. I know I'm supposed to go like this, but it's basically that. No, he doesn't say anything like that. He doesn't explain that. But the diminishing marginal product story isn't initially clear, but it becomes very clear. He and Ricardo really hash this out, and it becomes clear to everyone at some point. And he also emphasizes it's crucial to have the right kinds of incentives. He says maybe we can avoid this as long as we don't do something stupid like abolish private property that makes everything much worse. He defends private property as a fundamental thing that we need to avoid catastrophe, to make people, the incentive effect, people be responsible, okay? Well, here's how, just a little bit more and we'll stop. Godwin has posited this story of these idyllic, he writes about these tribes that wander the face of the earth. Idyllic tribes that in the past wandered the earth. They were in harmony with nature, perfect happiness, and something bad happened. We invented private property. It upset the scheme. People became unequal. Unhappiness ensues. Anybody ever see the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy? We should probably watch that for HET. It's a great movie. It's a South African film, and it's got a lot of stuff going on in it. But it starts out with this airplane flying over, and there are these bushmen who live, hunter-gatherers, and somebody throws an empty Coke bottle out of the airplane. And it lands, and they find it, and then their whole society is upset because they all start fighting over the Coke bottle. And they think it's been dropped down by the gods. It's a really great movie. But at any rate, but that's exactly what the point is that these guys have, that Godwin has, that private development of private property upset the perfect scheme. And the solution would be to have perfect equality among people, but to do that we have to abolish private property. And then that would take us back to the natural, ideal state, and we'd be perfectly happy and maybe live forever. And then Godwin says, there is a principle. He's talking about these these natural societies, I guess. There is a principle in human society by which population is perpetually kept down to the level of the means of subsistence. Thus, among the wandering tribes of America and Asia, we never find through the ages that population has so increased as to render necessary the cultivation of the earth. So he imagines these happy tribesmen. They're living off the fat of the land, living a great life, everything's cool. No need to work, it's just great. And Malthus quotes that, and then Malthus says, okay, yes, this principle by which they don't have to, the population doesn't get too big, this principle, which Mr. Godwin thus mentions as some mysterious and occult source, and which he does not attempt to investigate, will be found to be the grinding law of necessity, misery, and fear of misery. So much for utopia. The reason the happy tribesmen, the noble savages, don't get overpopulated is they die off from famine and wars when they're fighting over food. It's not so nice. That's his argument. Now, of course, we all know that nobody could ever believe this kind of stuff today, right? I'm going to send you an article. What's the worst thing? Anybody here from a farm or ranch? Background, sort of. Is that a garden? What's the worst invention that humans ever came up with? What was humanity's biggest mistake? If you're a professor at Berkeley, what do you think it is? A world-famous professor who's a much better selling author than anybody at Hillsdale, any of your professors at Hillsdale. Agriculture. Agriculture. Humanity's biggest. Do you guys know Jared the Diamond? Very famous. He wrote Germs and Steel, and he also wrote Collapse. Very famous, best-selling author, professor. I think he's at Berkeley. Robert Sapolsky. Jared Diamond maybe is at UCLA. I've written down. They move around. Robert Sapolsky of Stanford University. Very famous. He's an anthropologist and a neuroscientist who's studied apes and things like this. Sapolsky argues that the high pinnacle of human society was the hunter-gatherer. We'd be better off if we went back to that. And Jared Diamond says, yeah, agriculture was the biggest mistake. I'll send you the article. It's not stupid, the argument that he makes. It's based, the stuff that he talks about is serious, about what happened to human diets and how much worse they became when they developed agriculture. He's talking about anthropological evidence. Okay, so, I will send also something that disagrees with that. And anyway, oh, we're out of time. Did Joshua? You had a